Today on Virtual Production Insider, we are defining what a render node is and how it works. All right, everybody, sit down and shut up. Welcome to Virtual Production Insider. I'm your host, David Stapp, and today is a continuation of our Virtual Production 101 series where we break down fundamental elements of virtual production. Today, we're going to define what a render node is, look at how it fits into the hardware ecosystem of virtual production, and even give some recommended specs if you want to build your own render node. So let's first start by defining what a render node is. A render node is a member of a group of computers rendering the same scene in parallel. Now, one thing I want to point out right off the bat is that a render node is really just a computer. It's a really high-end, powerful PC that is responsible for rendering your scene out of Unreal Engine. Now, the definition might lead you to believe that it's more than one computer, but there are many studios that just have one single render node, but you may need to add multiple render nodes as your studio scales. Now, you might think you could just use the computer you're using to create the environment to also render it to the wall, but you don't want to do this because then it's going to be rendering the scene in two places and it's going to really affect your performance. This is why every studio has multiple computers that have different roles. You have your engine node computer, which is where you're creating the environment, but then you have your render node computer, and its sole job is to render your Unreal Engine scene to your LED wall and nothing else, because you want to ensure that all of your processing power is being dedicated to that scene. And in a lot of render node setups, the only display connected to it is the actual LED wall itself. The LED wall becomes a giant Windows monitor at that point. Now, to access those render nodes to make changes, they use what's called KVM, and this is something we've actually defined here on the channel before, but it basically allows you to access a computer that's elsewhere in the building via fiber so that you can remote in and make changes. Now, we've had a lot of studios popping up over the years, and they all have different configurations and different wall sizes, but typically, if you have an LED wall, say 30 feet wide or less, you can typically get away with a single render node, given that you don't have a lot of fly walls or ceiling overheads, because the more you start to add, the more geometry that needs to be rendered across the canvas. And then you're at the mercy of your LED processor. This is one of the things that are going to be connected to your render node. Basically, your computer goes to render the scene, it sends that signal to the LED processor, and then the LED processor takes that and says, okay, here's how I take that image and scale it across this large display. Now, there's a lot more to LED processors in terms of how many processors you need and how many pixels they can handle, but we're going to save that for another episode in this Virtual Production 101 series. So if you want to learn more about LED processors, be sure to subscribe. So when do you need multiple render nodes? Well, it really comes down to how big of a resolution we're needing to render on the LED wall. Like I mentioned before, you have an LED processor, but those can only handle so many pixels, and when you get into LED wall resolutions, they can get massive, sometimes getting over 8K. And so this is why on a lot of the larger LED volumes, they have multiple render nodes so that they can split up the scene into different sections to be rendered by one of those render node computers. This keeps the resolution lower and puts a lot less load on the components of that one machine. And so that's a really good kind of general overview of how render nodes fit into the hardware ecosystem. So now I want to look at some recommended specs that I see in a lot of render node setups. So starting with the CPU, you're going to be typically putting in an AMD Threadripper CPU. Now, some people are going to have different opinions on how many cores you should put in there, but in my opinion, I think the 32-core Threadripper is the better deal because it has a higher single-core clock speed than the 64-core version. And really, the CPU's main job when it comes to Unreal Engine and rendering is going to be used for two main purposes: compiling shaders and CPU light baking. Now, I say that because there is also the new GPU light mask feature where you don't even have to use the CPU to bake your lights. And of course, you could go with less or more cores here. This is just what I would recommend if I were building my own render node. Now, next up is the RAM, the random access memory, and I would put in a minimum of 128 gigabytes of DDR5 RAM. But if you've got a little extra cash, you could go up to 256 gigabytes of RAM just to make sure you're future-proof. But of course, pay attention to the specs of your motherboard because this will dictate how many slots and how much RAM capacity it can handle. Now, I don't really have any specific motherboard to recommend here, but a few key things to look at in your motherboard are the socket type for your CPU to make sure it matches, the amount of RAM you want to be able to put in there, the amount of M.2 slots for, really fast storage, and the PCI Express slots for your graphics card, which is the next thing we're going to look at. And that moves us into one of the most important components of a render node, and that is the graphics card. That should be no surprise to anybody, but this is the component that Unreal Engine uses the most, and it's honestly the place where you're going to put the most money into as well, because the industry graphics card for virtual production is the NVIDIA A6000. Now, at the time of this video, there are two flavors of this graphics card. There's the regular A6000 and there's the A6000 Ada. Now, I personally would go with the Ada version, and I would recommend putting in two graphics cards into your render node. Whether you're on a single render node setup or a multi-render node setup, I would put two graphics cards in there because this allows you to take advantage of certain features like multi-process rendering or SMPTE 2110 down the road, where you're going to be able to get more processing power out of your render node. Now, one thing to keep in mind is these graphics cards go for several $1,000s each. So again, this is where you're going to be putting the majority of your money. Now, one of the other critical components that is actually an accessory to your graphics card is a Quadro Sync card. This is the component that allows you to receive Genlock and synchronize the graphics cards in your render node. This is an absolute must-have accessory that you should not skip out on. Now, another component that's similar to this to consider is something like an Aja or Blackmagic video card, because if you're doing green screen virtual production, you need to be able to receive a video signal from the camera on set so that you can do the keying on the computer. Now, again, this is just the specs that I would recommend using. You're going to find a lot of different ways to approach this, but these are some of the most common components and configurations that you're going to find in a lot of render node setups today. So use this as a starting point, but you could always modify this and build out from there. So that's it for today, guys. I hope that was a good general overview of what a render node is, how they function, and how to even build your own. Now, if you like this video, if you found anything of value, please be sure to like it. And hey, subscribe to the channel. And I typically don't do this, but I do want to tease our next episode coming out in a couple weeks. And this is a virtual production breakdown of the show Fallout. And if you saw our previous Batman episode, these are some of my favorite ones to do. They give a lot of insight into how virtual production is being used at the highest level. And I'm not going to lie, this new Fallout episode is probably going to be our best episode yet. You do not want to miss it. We've got some really fun things planned for it. So be sure to subscribe so that you can catch that episode when it releases in a couple weeks. And if you haven't already, be sure to join our Discord server. This is a place where you can come and surround yourself with other people in the virtual production community. And as always, I'm David Stapp with Virtual Production Insider, and we'll see you next time.